if you recall, at the beginning of the war and the lead up to the war, Russia's position and the position of a lot of water carriers for Putin um, took the position that the Ukrainians in eastern Ukraine, if not all of Ukraine, right? I mean, that's Putin's position, it's all of Ukraine. But the ones in Donetsk and Kherson and all that kind of stuff, that these Ukrainians are in fact just Russians. And Putin wrote this big sort of Unabomber kind of letter explaining this point, or explaining his version of it. He still to this day talks about, Russians from Ukraine or Russians who speak Ukrainian. Um, there's a lot of this sort of, these are authentic Russians. I think it's really fascinating, and we're not going to get into it now, but what is so amazing to me about some of these claims about Russian identity are not genetic or ethnic, in the sense that, I wrote about this in my book. I've talked about this a few times. Before notions of biological racism come in the late 19th century, um, uh, nationalism, particular ethnic nationalism, particularly German nationalism that you get from Johann Fichte and Herder and all these guys, was um, really based in language. It was like German speaking was the test of whether or not you were a true German. And you could hear in the way they talked about German speaking, how it was untainted by Romance languages, and it wasn't Latinized, right? This was their big dig at all these other mud languages. That the German language was the language that was rooted in the German soil to pre-Roman times, and you could see how easy it would be to take those sort of constructs and arguments and flip them into genetic biological racism arguments, because they were so close to it to begin with. But anyway, the Russians aren't making biological racist arguments. They're throwing back to these linguistic arguments that basically, if you're a Russian speaker, you're Russian. And if you read some of their public statements and Putin speeches and all this kind of stuff, they talk about protecting Russian speakers in places like Estonia and Latvia and Moldova and all these kinds of places, and as if all you need to be part of the Russian protectorate, the part of the zone of Slavophile ownership of the Russian Empire, is just be a native Russian speaker. And I just think it's such a interesting way of thinking about things. You get shades of this that are much more harmless and less tied up in weird history in terms of the Spanish language sometimes. But I think it's just really interesting. Anyway, I told you I wasn't going to digress, and I did. I apologize. I'm doing it. It is what it is. So, although I have to say, the digressions are one of the only things that prove I didn't write out any of this beforehand. That and the incredibly meandering, insubstantial nature of the content to begin with. What was I going to say? Oh, right. So, regardless of the metaphysical, genealogical arguments about what makes a Russian or doesn't make a Russian, Putin has asserted that all of these Russians, all these people in Ukraine are Russians, right? They are Russians, according to Putin. And in fact, he held these referenda that were totally bogus and rigged, shortly after the launch of the invasion, to be able to claim that these were now Russian republics. Okay, so I don't think they're Russian republics. I don't think those referenda have any legitimacy. Um, I don't think Putin's history of this stuff is very good. It's obviously more complicated. I've been reading this, listening to this Orlando Figes, I think is the way you pronounce his last name, book, The Story of Russia. And Russia is a effed up country going way back. Pod and I got into a big text back and forth the other day because he's such a fan of Russian literature, and he thinks that is a more of a saving grace for the greatness of Russia as a historical entity than I do. But I mean, I think Russian literature is great, all that, but man, it's a dysfunctional society going way back because of accidents of history and geography and all that. Regardless, again, I apologize for the digression. Putin says these people are Russians. He made it a matter of law that these people are Russians. And now what is he doing? Well, first of all, they blew up this dam. More Ukrainians on the Russian-held side of the dam were killed by this thing. And even if you want to sort of say, assertions of Russian responsibility for the exploding of the dam should be non-admissible in this argument until later, that's fine. I mean, I disagree with you, but I understand it. It's a legitimate thing. It could turn out that there's some other story about the dam. I honestly and sincerely doubt it will, but let's just put that aside. In the places that he has pulled out of or moved troops around, they are leveling shells, artillery daily at places that they say are occupied by Russians. I mean, this is them killing people that they no longer claim are Ukrainians, that they claim are Russians. And all of the sort of Putin apologists, let's, stop helping Ukraine people, just don't care about this, right? They don't think it's a variable that should be entered into the equation at all. And, just imagine if, we were, that we took a chunk of Mexico, we declared everybody here are Americans. We passed a plebiscite or whatever, declaring that this little chunk of Mexico is now America. And these people and gave everybody American passports and all the rest. And then started bombing them. I mean, again, you could have different appraisals of the perfidy of that, about the evil or criminality of that, or the, or the morality of it. I mean, it's a weird scenario to think about, right? And I don't know that I've thought it through the analogy all that much myself, but to say that it's not something worth taking notice of, it's not something worth to sort of ask yourself, well, what does this say about what kind of project Putin is running here, right? What kind of war is he running here? What kind of argument is he making where he is perfectly happy to murder these people that he's just declared are all Russians? And it's weird to me that it just doesn't even enter the conversation. Whatever you make of it, whether you're pro-Putin or anti-Putin, it's kind of strange. And the only explanation I can come up with is that everybody knows that Putin was always lying, and doesn't care about any of these sort of grand things, in the sense that, like, yeah, he thinks Ukraine belongs to Russia, but he doesn't care about individual actual human beings enough, one way or the other, Russians or Ukrainian or otherwise, and that it's all just pretense and propaganda. And so I think that's the only good explanation for people in my camp, is that it just confirms the evilness of Putin and move on. But it's amazing how it doesn't enter into the equation of, Robert F. Kennedy and Glenn Greenwald and Tucker and these people who, just whistle zippity doodah past these inconvenient facts.